Before we get to the circle, we need to understand the distance formula and the midpoint formula. It's just about having 2 points. On this one, we have point -3, and I'm going to call it point number 1, -3, 3. And this one right here, I'm going to call it point number 2. And this is 5, -3. Now that I have my 2 points, because this is point number 1, I'm going to label this as x1, y1, and this one x2, y2. And then I'm going to substitute those values on the formula. So I'm going to end up with x2 as 5 minus x1, so minus -3 squared plus y2, in this case -3, minus y1, so minus and the +3 squared. This will become the square root of 5 minus -3, it'll be 8. So that's 8 squared plus -3 and -3 will give you a -6, and that will be squared. And then this will become the square root of 64, 8 squared, plus -6 squared, that's 36. That's the square root of 100, and the distance will be 10. To find the midpoint, we're going to use once again x1 and x2. In this case, it doesn't really matter the order because you're going to add them. So x1 is -3 plus x2, 5 divided by 2. And y1, that's 3 plus y2 plus -3 divided by 2. And at the end, you're going to have 2 divided by 2, comma. And this is going to be 0 divided by 2. So the final answer, or the midpoint, is going to be 1, 0. And if you notice, it actually makes sense that the midpoint is at 1, 0. So that's a way to find the distance and the midpoint. Now, we're going to keep moving. So let's say that we have a circle, and that circle has a center at 3, 1. If you want to find the equation of a circle, first you need to find the distance between the center and any point on the circumference. Let's say this point, or even this point right here. Any of those will get you the radius. On this one, it's quite easy to see what the radius is going to be. If this is 3 and it reaches all the way to 8, we know that the radius will be 5. But let's use the distance formula. But because we're no longer finding just a distance, but the radius, I'm going to just, instead of d, write r. And I'm going to call this the point that I'll be using. So let's say that this is point 8, 1, and I'm going to call it x1, y1. And this one right here, I'm going to call it point C, or the center. And for now, I'm going to call it x2. Let me put the C here. I'm going to call it x2, y2. And I'm going to substitute those values. Or better yet, let's call the center x1 and y1. This is going to be x1, y1, and I'm going to call this point number 2 at 8, 1, and this as x1, y1. And this is the center. So now I'm going to substitute those values on the equation. And you'll see why in a moment. I'm doing it this way. So that is x2 This is x2 and y number 2. So x2 is going to be 8 minus x1, 3, and I'm going to square it. And then y number 2, that is a 1, minus y number 1, in this case, 1. And I'm going to square it. So this is going to be equal, let me keep going here, the radius is equal to the square root of 5 squared plus 0 squared, and the radius will be equal to the square root of 5 squared, that's 25, and the answer will be 5. So we already knew that the radius was going to be 5, so we have a circle with center at 3, 1, and a radius of 5. What would have happened if I, instead of using this point, I used this point, or what happens if I use this point right here as point number 2, or if I use this point as point number 2? It doesn't matter which point I use, as long as it is on the circumference, the radius is going to be 5. So basically, it's telling you that the distance from the center, and the center we're going to call it h comma k, to any point called x2 comma y2, or for that matter x comma y, is going to be equal to the radius. Doesn't matter which point you use, as long as you find the distance from the center to any point. So the radius basically is equal to the distance from any point x2, as long as it is on the circumference, so x2, to the center, which I'm going to call x1, y1. And if the center is h comma k, it's going to be x2 minus h squared plus y2 minus k squared. And instead of writing it as a square root, if I square both sides of the equation, this side and this side, I'm going to have the radius squared is equal to x, in this case 2, or just x on the circumference, minus h squared plus y minus k squared. So this is basically the equation of any circle. And if you substitute the center, which is h comma k, and the radius, in this case 5, you're going to have the standard form of the equation of the circle. So I'm going to substitute the 5 squared is equal to x minus h, in this case 3, squared plus y minus k minus 1 squared is the equation of this circle right here. And it all comes from the fact that the distance between the center and any point on the circumference will be always the same. So if I substitute this point right here, or this point right here, and I find the distance from that point to the center, it will always be 5 in this particular case.